Hey Clarity crew, it's me, Islamic Clarity, and we're here to make Islam's teachings clear to the world in English. Today we're going to walk through Dr. Hashmi's critique of the standard narrative on Quran preservation and his argument for the dynamic preservation narrative. Dr. Hashmi is a modernist Muslim from Harvard University. He used to be a very traditionalist Sunni Muslim who would engage in polemics against other sects of Islam. However, now he is proudly a modernist Muslim who wants to draw from all streams of Islamic intellectual history to respond to Islam's critics. He's critical of both people like Farid and David Wood. And a modernist Muslim, some people would call it a progressive or a liberal Muslim. So after Yasser Qadhi's June 8th Holes in the Narrative interview, Dr. Hashmi gave his perspective on the Quran preservation narratives. We're going to focus on his summary of the Western historical critique of the standard narrative. So first, in this first clip, he's going to explain what the standard or the traditional narrative even is.
So the traditional view is that all of these different ahruf, and ahruf are translated as modes, different readings, these are all directly from Allah. That is the key point. They are from Allah and not from the companions. And by the way, in the tradition, they differentiate between the ahruf and the qira'at. The qira'at are the recitations. That you can just, you could just say is mostly pronunciations and stuff and the way you recite, but you can't say that about the ahruf. As we saw, those have a lot more differences that are not just pronunciation. And we saw the 5 different, some of them more pronunciation, some of them more a slight changing in wording. Now, according to the traditional theory, Allah or Gabriel is said to have revealed the Quran directly to the Prophet in one harf, or one way, and then in a subsequent 6 more ways, or ahruf. So these ahruf are all directly tied to Allah or Gabriel. And another explanation that's given is that these ahruf were because of the various dialects of the Arab tribes or clans. So these were based on the regional differences that Allah or the Prophet wanted to allow the Quran to be understandable to all these different people with different dialects. And Sheikh Yasser writes, and this is his view from before, quote, the wisdom in the various ahruf was to facilitate the memorization of the Quran. Since the Quran was revealed in 7 ahruf, this greatly eased its memorization and was a way of making the preservation and propagation of the Quran easier. So this is the traditional justification. Now, we're going to use the historical critical method to see, does this really stand the test? Here are the hadiths that are used to justify this idea that the Quran was revealed in 7 harfs or 7 modes. Jibril in this hadith, for example, is said to have recited the Quran first in 1 harf, and then the Prophet himself asked that it be recited in another harf, then another harf, then another harf. So here the Prophet is the one who's requesting this. In this other hadith, however, it's Gabriel who is doing the commanding and saying that you need to recite the Quran in these multiple different harfs. So first Gabriel commands, that says that God commands it in 1 harf, then 2, then 3, then 4, and then eventually 7 harfs. Then in a third hadith, we see that there is some conflict between these first 2 hadith, by the way. Now in this third hadith, we have 2 of the Sahabas. This is a key hadith, so pay attention right now. So you have Umar ibn al-Khattab and another companion, Hisham ibn Hakim, who get in this debate. They get into a conflict. They go into loggerheads because one of them is reciting the Quran in one way, and then the other is saying, how dare you recite it that way? You're reciting the Quran incorrectly. And then they both go to the Prophet, they rush to the Prophet, and the Prophet says, okay, you recite, he asks one of them to recite the Quran, and after that person recites that verse, the Prophet says, yes, that is how it was revealed. It was revealed this way. Then he asks the other companion to do the same. He recites it in a different way, and then the Prophet nods and says, yes, it was revealed in this way. And he says, indeed, the Quran has been revealed. This is the Prophet now. Indeed, the Quran has been revealed in 7 different ahruf, so recite whichever one is easy for you. So again, this is all used to get this traditional theory.
Well, now he's going to explain some of the holes in the standard narrative.
Well, what are some of the problems? As even recognized by some of our own classical scholars, the tribal dialect explanation doesn't make sense. Umar and Hisham disagreed about how to recite the surah, but both were from the Quraysh. Sorry for the typo. In other words, They disagreed about the details, although they were both from the same tribe and spoke the same dialect. So this dialect excuse does not work. Furthermore, it seems difficult to hold that there are only 7 modes, or ahruf, to explain away all of the variants we discover in the various reports that scholars are now looking to and the manuscripts that we are discovering. Of course, one could say that it was not a literal 7 being referred to, but this means that there is a problem with the literal wording of the hadiths on the topic. Now, of course, the word 7 is often used, 7, 70, 700, etc., is used for, 7 is used for several, 70 is a little bit more, 700 is used for a lot, 7. So it is used in that way in Arabic. But the way the hadith itself is reported, that might be difficult to take at least the hadith literally. As Yasir Qadi concludes, and this is in his old text, the number of ahruf is exactly 7, not more, not less. This is according to the most traditional view. There are more problems. If it was Allah or Gabriel who recited these 7 ahruf to the Prophet, and then the Prophet is the one who propagated the Quran in these various modes, how does this facilitate the memorization of the Quran or help in its preservation and propagation? The obvious, non-credulous, the emperor is wearing no clothes response would be to say, no, this actually makes things much more difficult and confusing. That is, how to sort out these various recitations and readings, the infighting of the Sahaba themselves over it, and the obvious point that the first 4 caliphs immediately move to eliminate these differences and unite upon one standardized text. Most importantly, it strains credulity to say that all of these dozens and hundreds of variations come straight from the Prophet. The easier explanation, at least from the Western historical academic perspective, is that these variations came later down in the chain of transmission.
Next, Dr. Hashmi explains that Dr. Salim, who's a PhD, has a perspective, a narrative to explain this, but he respectfully disagrees. Dr. Hashmi respectfully disagrees with Dr. Salim. And Dr. Salim's narrative is basically that only the Hafs version is the correct Quran.
Now, by the way, I have to be honest, I was impressed by this dissertation and Professor Salim's work, but it's not the view that I take. I take the view that Mufti Abu Layth takes in this interview, so you can watch this interview to see these 2 different views. But according to Dr. Salim and his view, only the recitation of Hafs an Asim, that is the common reading that the vast majority of Muslims use, that 95% of the Muslim world uses today, is the correct one that is traced back to the prophets. The other readings are due to either in their various causes, but either due to the earlier revelatory sequences given to the prophets that are no longer applicable, or their explanations of the Sahaba themselves, that is when they were doing tafsir or commentary of the Quran, and they were using synonymous words to explain various words of the Quran that were then allegedly confused with the Quran itself. And then the mixing up of passages by certain readers, and even some were due to fabrication, just like hadiths were fabricated. So this view has the strength that it basically allows you to retain your view of the common reading that's used by all of us, and say that that is to the dot indisputable, and all of the other recitations, were due to these various reasons, and really we shouldn't use them.
And now Dr. Hashmi is going to explain his own view, dynamic preservation. He says it's also held by Mufti Abu Layth, Dr. Yasin Dutton, Dr. Ali, and himself, the 4 horsemen of dynamic preservation.
Professor Yasin Dutton is a believing and practicing Muslim. He's also in the Western Academy. He is in a South African university, I believe. I believe it is the emerging view of Muslims in the Western Academy, those who are engaged or even thinking about this idea of academic theology. It's held by not only Professor Dutton, but also by Professor Shabir Ali, Mufti Abu Layth, myself, and honestly several others. I just can't name names because I don't have the permission to reveal their names. Professor Dutton concludes that what is apparent is that this level of variation, this Quranic variation, does not in any way indicate a loose, unfixed text, or that there was ever more than one Quran, but rather, in the light of contemporary orality theory, that the Quran is essentially a multi-formed text, such as one would expect with a text that is manifested in a society where the oral, rather than the written, was the norm. I will explain this, don't worry. Mufti Abu Layth uses a really nice word. He uses the word dynamic. The Quran was from its inception dynamic. Now, so this is from Professor Dutton's article where he's quoting Professor Fred Donner. He is doing it critically. where Professor Fred Donner is saying that, yes, Western scholars would love to find the Ur Quran or the Ur text. What is an Ur text? It's a text that it was the original. We don't have the original now, but we can try to reconstruct some original text that was the first historical text. But what Professor Dutton concludes after the quote you see in the bottom, quote, "It will be clear from our deliberations above that not only is this not possible, but also that it is not necessary and that it doesn't make sense to search for this supposed Ur text." I'm going to give you an example. Now, it's a somewhat crass example, but really I have to use it because we no longer have an oral culture. One of the few examples that I can think of where we have an oral culture still is stand-up comedy. So when it comes to stand-up comedy, I remember this one time when I actually listened to this stand-up comic. He gave, it was amazing. It was hilarious. And then he actually forgot that he already visited our school, and he came back the next year. So almost the same exact audience and the same exact comic, and he gave the exact same stand-up routine as he gave the year before. Now, it was embarrassing for him that he gave the same one because people weren't laughing as much. But what I noticed was that even though it was just a year apart, it wasn't exactly the same. He didn't use word for word, verbatim, the same material. It was almost the same, but it was a little bit different. And that actually adds to its dynamism because he was kind of tweaking it a little bit for the audience that he now had, right? So if you watch stand-up comics, they'll use the same material. In their head, it's exactly the same. But when they articulate it, it comes out with slight variations, no matter which time they give it. Now, could you ever say, and this is Dave Chappelle, could you ever say when he's giving the same bit many times over the course of his life, imagine if now you were a Dave Chappelle scholar later in life, and you wanted to find the Ur text of Dave Chappelle. Which one would you use? Would you use his first time he delivered it? Would you use his last time it would deliver it? There really is no Ur text. It's nonsensical to talk about it. Rather, this is the way oral texts are transmitted. They exist in a very different way than our written form does. The example that Professor Dutton uses is of music. He talks about a musician who gave a song 20 years earlier, and then he was asked to repeat it. It didn't come out exactly alike. It was the same song, same meaning, same everything, but there were still some tweaks and variation. I think this will help you understand what these scholars are arguing about the Quran. And to cite proof, they would cite this hadith, and Professor Dutton cites this hadith, where it's the same story where these Sahabis are arguing over which verse of the Quran, which recitation is correct or not. And they conclude, we can't both be right and correct. And then the Prophet replies, the Quran was sent down to me and I was asked according to one harf or two, etc., etc. This until we reach 7 harfs. All of them are acceptable as long as you don't mix up an ayah of mercy with an ayah of punishment, or an ayah of punishment with an ayah of mercy. If the verse ends with mighty and wise, Azizun Hakim, and you say Samiun al-Alim, all hearing and all knowing, then Allah is all hearing and all knowing. That is to say, a good chunk of the Quran uses these formulaic phrases. If you interpose them, the Prophet himself in this narration did not, so we are today scandalized if we see this, but if we see that the Prophet he didn't mind this, according to this narration and other narrations too. That is to say, he was like, just focus on the meaning. This necessity to focus on exactly every dot and period, it seems to be a later development, especially it's even worse in the modern period. In another hadith, we see that, again, this idea that just don't change the meaning of the Quran. Minor synonymous wording is okay, according to this view. In other words, the Prophet seems to have been less of a dogmatist on exact wording and instead focused on the meanings of the Quran, which, as I have argued earlier, we, in any case, have tended to ignore. And this is Professor Dutton, who writes, quote, and this explains the Quranic variants, by the way. Some companions were reciting parts of the revelation using the same sort of variation that they had heard and witnessed the Prophet using and allowing others to use, and which they thus assumed they had ongoing prophetic authority for. It is presumably on this basis that we hear of various companions allowing some limited synonym variation. It is also reasonable that the third caliph, Uthman, sought to minimize these differences, especially given the move from an oral tribal society to a written and book culture. Moreover, with the expansion of the Islamic Empire, it no longer seemed a good idea to just infinitely allow a synonymized.
Here, Dr. Hashmi responds to the traditionalists who would disagree with dynamic preservation, saying that it compromises the integrity of the Quran too much, by saying, actually, you traditionalists with your stories like the sheep eating part of the Quran are actually the ones who are compromising the integrity of the Quran.
If we take this view, you don't have to, but I'm just putting it forward. If you can definitely take Dr. Salim's views on this, and you can even take the traditional view. So there's three views that you can take on this. Neither of these three views means that you need your faith to collapse. Now, if we take the third view that I take, is it a big deal? As my field advisor pointed out to me, these minor wording differences are actually much smaller than the interpretive differences we already have over the meanings of various Quranic verses. That is to say, the same Quranic verses are used, to, for example, to justify free will and to negate it. Furthermore, the Quranic promise that Allah will preserve the Quran, it still holds true. Some traditionalists may want to reach for their takfir guns now, but really, should they be the ones talking? They themselves abrogate or nullify dozens and dozens of verses from the Quran. They claim also that there was an ayat al-rajam, a verse of stoning that is missing from the Quran. They talk about a goat eating verses of the Quran. These, to me, seem to be greater insults to the Quranic integrity.
Dr. Hashmi argues Muslims should bite the bullet and take this new narrative, as he believes it is well suited against Western critiques and Islam's critics, while he's also acknowledging some of the theological challenges such a view will pose.
I think biting the bullet makes sense. I find biting the bullet to be more intellectually consistent, and it brings a great many benefits. That is, it inoculates us from any possible damage, quote unquote, from the Western historical critical method bearing down on the Quran. Quite simply, it fits the data. Furthermore, I think it is more problematic to claim that all of the other Quranic readings are incorrect and unacceptable. Have Muslims in various parts of the world been reading something other than the Quran for many long generations and even to the present day? Now, one could certainly still hold on to the traditional narrative and keep claiming that any variants go back directly to the Prophet and are a part of the 7 ahruf, or that they are simply errors. But I think the problem is that it strains credibility, especially if you're a Western scholar deeply studying this topic. I agree that we should only use the common reading today and that we should not synonymize anymore, because the early Muslim caliphs exerted great efforts to get it right. It was a very conscientious endeavor to preserve the Quran, and they did a fantastic job of it. In fact, traditionalists like to say that the hadith were a similar mechanism was used, and if you criticize the hadith, you're criticizing the Quran. I think this is a slander against the Quran. Really, the Quran, right from the get-go after the Prophet's death, there was a concerted effort to preserve the Quran, and we see the results now. Furthermore, I do think that if we're going to bite the bullet, we may have to reconsider our views of prophecy. This is why perhaps the traditionalists don't want us to bite the bullet. So yeah, I understand that, and I understand where they're coming from. But if you're interested in that, I refer you to my colleague and friend, Professor Khalil Andani. He has his whole dissertation topic on this, where he says that this idea that we have now of that Muslims view the Quran as literally God's word as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, and that in case you didn't realize that the Quran is in Arabic, so God speaks Arabic. He says this is an oversimplified and historically incorrect view of the Islamic tradition. In fact, it's much more vast than that. And I think we could look back at Ibn Sina's work on this, but even some of the Kalam theologians, even the Ash'ari theologians, have some profound ideas that we shouldn't poo-poo and we should look back to.
This is all very fascinating. We all saw why Q tried to maintain credibility among traditionalist Muslims while even trying to open the possibility of another narrative, and everyone saw how much he was attacked for that. Dr. Hashmi, I think traditional Muslims Traditionalist Muslims are worried that changing their doctrine of the Quran to include dynamic preservation will inevitably lead to a shift towards a more humanist or modernist Islam. Mufti Abu Layth and Dr. Ali are on the record for not accepting Aisha's age of 9, as the Islamic tradition suggests. Mufti Abu Layth has dressed as Santa Claus, and Dr. Ali has said that apostates should not be executed today. Very emphatically, he said that. So all of these things suggest a more humanist or modernist Islam that I think a lot of traditionalists view as heterodox, to say the least. Also, Dr. Hashmi, I wonder who you consider outside the fold of Islam. For example, if someone says the Shahada and says that the Quran is not the exclusive word of Allah, but just one of many equally valid scriptures, would that person still be a Muslim based on your standards? Just as you are critical of the traditionalists for having too narrow a view of who is a Muslim, I wonder if there are others who would be critical of you for also having too narrow a view. In Qurangate and the Quran War that's coming and is happening now, we're going to see traditionalists like Fareed, Hakekachu, and Sajid Lipham criticize Dr. Hashmi. Fareed said of Dr. Hashmi, quote, "Just came across an old school defender of the Sunnah that I haven't heard about in over a decade. Today he is a reformist that has been plagued by heretical views as a reaction to Western academia in his graduate studies." End quote. So Fareed has very strong words for Dr. Hashmi. Likewise, Dr. Hashmi wants to jump into social media and refute traditionalist excesses and provide another perspective on what a Muslim has to say on these issues. All of this should shed quite a bit of Islamic clarity. I hope that was relatively clear. I know this was kind of a long video, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the day.